Not saying that it's recording yet. Good. Right. So, John, thank you very much for being with us. Very exciting to have you with us. And this is also a way to continue the collaboration that we started between yourself and ourselves, between the Cybernetics Society and the Metaforum, and that now is getting very fruitful with all these webinars on the CyberSyn project that we've been organizing with Peter and Jonathan and other people from WOSC. So this is really nice. So the only question is, would you like the questions to be done by the end, or would you prefer to be interrupted?
Okay, so
I don't know what. Did you, this computer switch off all of a sudden? I don't know what happened. Did you lose?
You froze, Angela, so I started introducing myself.
Okay, let me check that the recording is going on.
And yeah, it is working at the moment.
Please, okay. Okay. Okay, it's all yours.
Okay, I shall go then. I called it Cybernetics and the Digital Transition because I needed a title, really, and for probably no greater reason than that. What I want to talk to you about this afternoon is a set of headings that I've put together just to guide me on the way through. Survival of the most viable, the cybernetics of organization, which most of the people on the call are expert in, the notion of the homeostat, a bunch of cases of things that I've been working on, which I think are worth sharing, and a move towards the allostatic organization, dynamic stability, and what I've called the cybernetics of cybernetics, which is trying to help us as a community to move the thing on and away from the sort of dark and obscure corners that we tend to operate in. Somebody's got their microphone on. I think it might be you, Theodore, perhaps. If we could, yeah, thank you. And then it'll work a bit better. So plan is I will talk for a while, then I'll shut up and you can sort of throw questions, objections and whatever at me. And I don't know whether you can see all that. I'm going to minimize the window at my end. So any organization, and I say this with the benefit of a father who was pre-polythene man, I think I'm pre-technology man, organizations that seek to thrive and thrive need to address the substantial challenges of recognizing and capturing the value of digital capabilities. And you'd have thought that, given that Lyons implemented the first accounting system in 1960 something or other, and computers have been around at least longer than I have, you thought that almost wouldn't need saying. But I wander around the various organizations I work with that range from very peculiarly the Church of England to Network Rail to various hospitals, police forces, etc. I still find that they have this embedded bureaucratic mental model of organization. That's something that goes back 100 and something years, maybe even to the first industrial revolution. They're very mechanistic in their thinking. They're very finite and solution focused, non-adaptive inevitably, very high latency driven by the nature of the hierarchies, and as John and I were discussing before we started, very low autonomy, very command and control type structures, and of course inevitably then very reactive. The grasp of technology, I think it would be polite to say it's frighteningly poor, and the understanding of technology capabilities with a typical manager in particular, they use their PC and tablet as a typewriter. They now manage their own diary, but the thought of actually doing computing with a computer seems to escape most of them, and particularly with one of my clients, with a large number of them, they spend an awful lot of time capturing data in very, very structured formats, capturing it and then processing it into forms that they can't possibly use. So they sort of dump it into PDF documents and reports and all sorts, where the data itself becomes unavailable to do anything useful with. And in some senses showing how little the world has moved on. When I drafted my PhD in 1993, I defined this thing called a perpetually failing problem-solving engine, which was the way that organizations go about not solving problems. And sadly, 30-something years on, quite a lot has not actually changed. The sort of current industrial revolution, IR 4.0 as it's being called, has a completely different mental model, and one which frankly is much more attuned to the sort of things that we folks typically like to talk about. It is values driven, it is about behaviors, it is about people, and it is about process. So those things are important. It is adaptive and infinite, preemptive, proactive. But the organization then in IR 4.0 is its information system. The organization emerges from the information rather more than it emerges from a hierarchical structure. And that's absolutely where Stafford was in about 1959 with cybernetics and management, if I recall correctly, and certainly through the workings of the VSM and all the stuff that goes with that. We have a really good platform on which we could be building these things. Cybernetics offers us the insights and capabilities that enable the realization of digital potential, and nothing else, frankly, does. Nothing else gets close to being able to help us explore this in this kind of way, because the cybernetics draws on the information to enable things to function. And it challenges in 3 dimensions. Purpose. What on earth is it we're trying to do? Who are the people and what are they doing and what's the process? And I put those together in those two models that you can see at the bottom, the what, how, and why. So on the left-hand side, you will recognize a corruption of the meta system in the sense that we have 3 things to do. We have to generate value as an organization in order to survive. We have to enable value, we have to create future value in effect, and we have to fulfill purpose. And we bring those 3 things together by the sharing of information in a useful manner. On the right-hand side, similar sort of thing. What we're really saying is that down here we have organization, and organization is about process and structure and decisions. And up here we have values and skills and behavior, the people dimension of our organization, all lined up together to try and achieve something that we will call performance or effectiveness, which is, again, fulfillment of purpose. Sitting in the middle of all that, we're joining it all together with an information system which has 2 dimensions to it. This is really interesting space. There's a hard quantitative dimension, bean counting and numbers and values and all that sort of stuff in a hard sense. But the really interesting part about an organization is actually how the people interact. And so the values and skills and behaviors, the soft bit of the organization, not in the sort of soft systems methodology sense, but in the sense of intangible, if you like. But it's that bit, is how people interpret the hard stuff and work together to solve problems that actually makes the organization itself become viable. And that's a bit that is for me massively misunderstood across a part of the cybernetics community, but is also massively misunderstood in organizations today who still seem to think in terms of pure, let's call it pure process. What sits at the heart of all that, what makes all that possible, is this idea of self-regulation, of adaptation, of stability and learning, which is about the homeostat. And the homeostat, for me, the core of everything we do in cybernetics is understanding how taking action on inputs generates outputs which go into an environment. The outputs then influence how we measure our performance. So we're building a learning cycle the whole time. And any one single homeostat standing on its own is always entertaining and good. But our organizations, and they are large and complex in ways that even 50 years ago we probably couldn't have envisaged, have complexity emerging in their behavior as organizations, and it emerges from the interactions of umpteen homeostats connected in something like real time. So the whole notion of a bureaucratic sort of Weberian type structure of everything has a place and everything in its place, etc., becomes a madness in essence in trying to keep the organization together. So we have to start thinking about, what does this self-regulating adaptive organization mean? How is it influenced? How does it distribute power, etc., in order to recognize that the viability, if we pick up that word, is itself emergent, and it emerges from a set of interactions of people informed by the information flows, the data flows around the organization. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 different cases, and I won't take forever over them, obviously. The Sisters of Nazareth is a charitable trust composed of 300 nuns rooted in Hammersmith. Fusion 21 is a social enterprise in Liverpool. Network Rail you'll all have heard of, I'm sure, particularly in the news today with High Speed 2. And the Pathfinder Initiative is a small charity that I'm involved with. And each of them offers us a slightly different insight to how we might think about and use the ideas of cybernetics to run our organizations. So, and I'm starting with the Sisters of Nazareth because they're sort of, it's an enormous privilege for anybody to get to work with a religious order, regardless of your failed Catholicism. And they're good fun apart from anything else. But they're really interesting because they have a whole different approach to the understanding and comprehension of hierarchy. And by way of example, in this particular instance, there are about 300 sisters within the congregation, distributed across 7 countries. They elect their leaders in a process where their global leadership is emergent from their national leadership and so on. But every 6 years, they rotate their board, if you like, the General Council. And so this week's Mother Superior General for the global congregation, is next week's receptionist. So they have a really, really interesting take on how hierarchy works and how power is associated with role, not individual. And that brings you to sort of a whole different way of thinking about the position that you're in. But it also means that as a community, you have to work in a very different way. So there it is, global organisation based in Hammersmith, 37 care homes, schools, nurseries, 7 countries. So England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, North America, Southern Africa, so South Africa and Zimbabwe, Australia, New Zealand. Every country has to have its own charity and has to be legally autonomous, and every house has to be largely autonomous because the distances in time, if nothing else, are massive. You cannot make decisions in Hammersmith for a house which operates in Western Australia. The time differences are too great all of the time. Frankly, you can't even make good decisions in Melbourne for a house that's in Geraldton in Western Australia. So they have to distribute power. And the way they typically did it in the good old days was they effectively abandoned it. They allowed a house superior to make all the decisions, and periodically she would report into the centre and say, well, we've done this, which didn't always work all that well. Similarly, you can't centralise control. You have to have it distributed. When I encountered them 2006-07, they were financially struggling, not quite on the teetering on the brinks of bankruptcy because they're very, very asset rich, but very cash poor. So together with bizarrely an Anglican priest, he and I, he's now got a PhD in cybernetics, by the way, so that was a win. We looked at the organisation, understood what the nature of its problem, and proposed, in essence, a separation of the assets from the service delivery, so that the congregation of sisters still owns all the assets, but the service delivery is undertaken by a number of subsidiary organisations that they also own, but then delivered by lay staff rather than by sisters. And one of the reasons for that is that the average age of the sisters at the point of intervention was 68 years, and they're probably now in their mid-70s on average. What was interesting about it was, of course, with the nature of the hierarchy that they have, you cannot dictate the change. The change has to be agreed collectively. And you suddenly think, okay, there's 300 nuns, there's 3,000 lay staff, and we have to get sufficient consent and support from all of them to actually make this change process work. So what we ran was a series of over 300, which is a staggering number of interventions, both at global level with a global meeting, at each country level, and at each house level over a period in the first place of about 3.5 years, where the problem was outlined, possible solutions were outlined, objections were handled, new ideas were discussed, and iterating that process in learning events, which was partly about educating the sisters to understand the new world and the new problems, partly about educating ourselves in what was going to work for them, so that we evolved a solution between us in this massive, massive number of events, which is compared to any normal organization. If I tell you that the Superior General was at every one of those 300 events, her job for this period was to manage and lead the change through this process. What makes it possible is their clarity of purpose. The recognition as an organization that what they were all about really was delivering what they called the care of the poor and needy. And that was interesting. That was fun, because what it let us do was understand what that meant in different contexts. The care of the poor and needy in Southern Africa is very different to the care of the poor and needy in Hammersmith or California. So we were able to have a shared purpose, but a localized interpretation of that, which resolved a number of things. And we built a lot of it around this notion of Peter Dudley's, which was, if you like, a reinterpretation of the meta system around the idea of what Pete calls the trialogue, of a conversation between today, tomorrow, and our sense of purpose, and how we integrate those things into a single decision-making model. So when you're looking at any decision, you're making that decision in the context of those three different insights. So that was quite fun. From a purely business point of view, they went from losing an amount of money each year that they didn't understand to making a global surplus and starting to invest in their premises and growing their business again. And the mark of success was they'd spent 25 years closing houses, and with our support and help, they managed to open a new one. So a real win. But again, the whole thing really powerfully driven by the need to have the conversation, to engage the people, to have a process in which the people owned the decisions. Because not only was it's not just a business, it's the sisters' homes, the sisters' lives, the sisters' sense of their mission to God. So a fascinating one to work with. By contrast, Fusion 21, a social enterprise based in Liverpool that does something as mundane as procurement of parts and labour for the repair and maintenance of social housing. I got involved with Fusion in 2009, and their initial request was to consider their information strategy. They were a small organisation. And the thing I've pulled out from all the work that I've done with them is this space, that the space of managing the present and creating the future, and how you synthesize the conversation between on the right-hand side of sort of kind of where are we now, what are we doing, how are we doing it, how are we managing, and you'll recognize a sort of very VSM-like process homeostats sitting in there, albeit the picture's somewhat reversed. And over on this side, we've got the sort of cloudy space of system 4, and what does the problematic future look like, and how do we synthesize in the middle that conversation between where are we now, where would we like to be, and how are we going to get there, where should we go. And of course we do that by building these greatly simplified models of today and tomorrow, and having a conversation around them, which is where the core part of strategic decision making came to be. At the point where I first was involved with Fusion, and this is important because it speaks to the value of the work that we do. Turnover was about £2.5 million, and they were marginally, and I think it's fair to say marginally profitable. They were making profits, but not hugely so. So the intervention started with sort of thinking about how does information flow around this organisation, or how should it flow, because it didn't. So we started to build this sort of information flow model around it, and started to use that as a device for designing the organization. So this is how the information is going to flow around the organization. What does it need to look like in terms of a structure to map that flow? So each of these things then became, of course, homeostatic in itself. Importantly, throwing off data into parallel or orthogonal systems that told us about performance at the same time. So we restructured the whole thing along the lines of the viable systems model, and you can see here we use the language VS Manager, VS Developer as language to describe what was going on. What we built out of that was then to think about what I called a lean information system. So rather than the complexities of traditional ERP type systems. What does it actually look like if we think, if these are the information flows that we're trying to handle, from capturing a first conversation with a potential customer all the way through to delivery of a project over here. What does that need to look like in terms of an overall data architecture? So we start off down here with the usual stuff: data table sitting at the bottom, then the key process flows across the organization, compiling up into then reporting in systems that derive their results directly from the process activity at the bottom level. So the interesting thing about this is if you place an order now, the whole system updates in real time so that you can actually see business performance in close to real time. So if as a board member, I were to ring up and say, where are we at this year? The finance director will say to me, well, do you want now or do you want 10 minutes ago or whatever? There is no constructed reporting that has to be done in any sort of post hoc way. It just emerges from the process capture within the organization, which is immensely powerful as a way of managing information in the organization. You can see the sorts of things that it lets us do. To give you an idea, we actually built the first version within the organization by hand, literally. It's pretty much carved it out of stone before going out into the marketplace and saying, build us one of these. The power, I suppose, when we moved into the first lockdown of COVID in 2020, and it was decided that everybody had to work from home, the way we had designed and built the process management system and the performance management system on the back of it meant that people were just told, well, okay, go and work from home. And the organization carried on the basis of that information system, performing better during COVID than it had before, because we took a whole bunch of cost out without losing any revenue, with everybody working from home and the systems continuing to work. As a board member, and bear in mind this is a social enterprise, last year, this is public information, so it's okay to talk about. Last year, we turned over about £8 million. And bearing in mind, this is public sector procurement, we made a donation of in excess of £3 million to our owning foundation. So the bottom line of all this work is that the organisation is not only much more powerful and effective in what it does for its clients, but also massively more financially effective than most of its competitors. So over the last 3 years, we've put £10 million into a charitable foundation, and that money is all then applied back into generating social value for the communities that are served by the core business of the purpose of the business. So we've got a real circular economy thing going on, and we've used the idea of homeostats throughout it all to embed self-reflection at every level. So each of these bits down here at the bottom, that's a sort of a line of business activity, is largely self-regulating within the confines that we've created, but they're hugely liberal because nearly all the people work from home, work away from the office. So not only does it work, but it's also financially very successful and a very stable organisation, generating its own stability from the adaptations that it's making in the pace that it needs to. And public sector procurement, as I'm sure you all know, is changing massively. When we look then and go from Fusion, which is say 8 million turnover, give or take, and then we start to have a conversation with much larger organisations, and to give you a scale on Network Rail, about 100,000 employees, 40,000 of them direct, 60,000 indirect. The railway is 20,000 miles long, 30 yards wide, with effectively an infinite number of bits of components broken down into, if I remember rightly, 7 regions, and those regions are broken down into lines of routes and so on. So it's a massively complex organisation. And I was approached by the head of weather and resilience, because the problem the railway has is it cannot manage itself well under difficult weather conditions, and we've all experienced the train that's late or failed or whatever when that sort of thing happens. So Brian's question was, can we use information to make a more meaningful assertion about the impact on service performance of adverse weather events. Now here, we're not solving the problem of the entire 100,000 person, 5 billion a year rail industry. We're talking about one element of the railway and its response to weather. And we came up with a conceptual model based again on a set of homeostats that said, okay, in the middle here, if we've got a seasonal weather range, we get our information from the Met Office, about the least worst place to get weather information in this country. So let's accept that we've got some weather information, but let's learn about the degree to which that weather prediction is right and wrong. So starting to use information about rightness and wrongness right at the outset to understand the degree to which we need to manage things. Once you've got that, you've then got a seasonal specification. So, and this is for railway assets. What's the specification for that asset, and what's the defined operating range under which it should perform? And then down at the bottom part of this, the third loop, is we've got seasonal preparation. To what extent have we actually prepared our assets to deal with the weather that we're expecting? So we've got homeostat one, which is learning about the accuracy of weather predictions. We can then look at the specification and ask the question, if the specification is right, i.e. the defined operating ranges are right, then we get the performance that we're planning, and so we can say the specification is appropriate. If we get amber or red, clearly it isn't. Similarly, did we maintain it at the level of performance that we're looking for? So again, we get greens, ambers, and reds. So you've got a triple homeostat operating here, around learning about the ability of the railway to adapt to the weather and able to target. Well, basically, the weather information we're getting is garbage. So let's get better weather information, better specifications for the. Sorry, my wiggler's gone. Better specifications for the equipment. So can we make better equipment to improve resilience? And down here, can we improve our performance in terms of managing that and its suitability for where we are? And at the bottom, you'll see I put down there the Heisenberg-Schrödinger railway. And I know that there's bound to be a physicist somewhere in the room. So please forgive my sort of liberal interpretation of both of these things. The idea of Heisenberg, as you know, is the uncertainty principle, that we can know what condition something's in, or we can know how fast it's moving, but we can't know both. And that's interesting because when we have a sort of 20,000 mile long, 50-yard railway made up of billions of components, all we know to a certainty is it wears out as we use it. So we can work out how fast it's wearing out, or we can work out what condition it's in, but we actually can't know both of those things at the same time, which gives us a challenge. Similarly, Schrödinger, we all know about is the cat dead or alive, and we don't know till we open the box. Similarly, the Schrödinger element of this is to consider that the only thing we can ever know to a certainty about a railway is that it was okay the last time we drove a train on it. So we have a collapsing probability wave in front of any new train that says, it was okay, it was okay, it was okay. And that's all we can know to be accurate about. So we have to actually start thinking about how do we use information when we have two sets of collapsing probabilities about the condition of our railway, and yet every time we put a train on it, we're putting 300-400 lives at risk. And when we have weather intervening in that, we amplify the challenges. So there's some thinking there about uncertainty, about information, which we need to have better means of dealing with. So we came up with this idea, the seasonally agnostic railway model, and it kind of works most of the time. It's quite reasonable. Moving from that initial conceptual diagram, we get to this. So I'm picking up the thread earlier on of autonomy. The key to this is capturing data at the lowest possible level. And the lowest possible level is what's called an operational route section. That's a little bit of railway between two stations, two known points. So all of our predictions are made at that individual level, which is interesting, and then aggregated up into lines of route, regions, and the whole railway. So the whole idea is to localize as much as possible the information and localize the decision making to the particular operational route section. So that whereas at the moment it's windy outside here in my hotel room in York, and I can tell you if there's a wind gust predicted of more than 53 miles an hour anywhere in the country, a blanket speed limit is of course applied to the entire rail network. which is mad. Whereas if I could say, well, actually, there's a 53-mile-an-hour gust on the East Coast main line between Doncaster and York, we can just slow the trains down there because that's the only relevant part. The contribution of that, of course, is it improves the railway. If it improves the railway performance, it improves the financial performance, and so on. So what Brian wanted to be able to do was tell the railway and tell the Department of Transport how it could do it better, but at the same time tell the customers about what was likely to happen, so consequently they can improve the way they run their bits of the railway. So overall, we've got this sort of idea that we capture data at a local level and then make local decisions, but also able to aggregate to lines of route regions and the whole railway, and to distribute information out to people who need it, whose lives are influenced by it. And of course, go back to that diagram, make the whole damn thing learn so that its assertions become more accurate over time. And hence you end up with this sort of learning model of the whole thing. You'll all recognize bits of potentiometer up here that are interlinked. And similarly, we have a potentiometer around each of the asset classes. So we're able to look at each asset, understand its condition, its management, its service regime, etc., maintain it in accordance with or not, and then make a meaningful assertion about its impact on the performance of the railway now and in the longer term. And today I'm in conversation with the Rail Safety and Standards Board about making assertions about the impact over 10 or 15 years of climate change on future railway, which will be a fun thing to do if we can get to commercial terms. But it shows the power again of what we're able to start doing when we think about this sort of what Pete Dudley calls the informational cybernetics. The feedback result from all that, of course, to feedback in is we're back to the seasonal weather range, the seasonal specification, and how that gets translated into mechanical things. Getting useful to get a scale on this, a 5-year program. The short term, we're delivering a working version and aiming by March next year to have that. In the longer term, we're thinking about a new world for an intelligent railway, and particularly using this as a starting point for getting the organisation as a whole to start using information in a much more intelligent manner. We've got 3 doctoral students in place. The first one is how good a decision can we make given the data available? And this is back to the sort of Heisenberg-Schrödinger problem that we will never know to a certainty about the quality of the assets. Therefore, we're always making some sort of judgment-based decisions, and how good can they be given the unknowability of some of the problems, which is quite an interesting one, very philosophical piece on that. On a more sort of practical but still somewhat philosophical level is how do we scale up machine learning? Because this whole thing will rely on machine learning to something that's going to have 36,000 individual interacting homeostats. If we do the entire railway, which is the ambition, that's a massive an interesting problem, to the extent that the Met Office have offered us their spare computer to run it on at various times. So that could be quite interesting. And the final one, and we've only just appointed to this particular role, was how does the organisation develop a shift in culture from reliance on what I called WADILT to near real time. So we have always done it like that. Which is how they make most of their decisions most of the time, and they have decisions that go back to about 1835 in terms of the way they do certain things, and we need to overcome some of those things which are no longer appropriate to the modern railway. And to get them to near real time. And near real time is interesting. Real time in a railway is anything up to 3 or 4 days out from now. So most of the operating decisions for today were made 3 or 4 days ago because it takes that long to promulgate through the system. It would be interesting to collapse that to get much nearer to real time than they currently are. They currently upload a diagram for the day about 4 o'clock in the morning, but it was developed 2 or 3 days ago. So there's some sort of massive information processing issues there, which drive the performance of the railway and drive the performance of the organisation in ways which are largely hidden from us. But the key is, as an organisation, they're just not using information even remotely intelligently. Pathfinder is another interesting one. I'm going back to behaviour here. This is something I've been involved in for the last 15 years or so. 9 events in 4 locations over 45 days, about 300 young people a year going through a programme, which is designed to reduce the number of reportable collisions, and reportable because they're the only ones that get counted, in which young drivers are involved in their first 12 months on the road, and typically 1 in 4.5 or 5 young people will have a reportable. Reportable is damage to people or property in their first 12 months, which is pretty horrific. Our young people, it's 1 in 19, which is considerably better, and although it's small numbers, it's been consistent over multiple surveys, so we have reasonable reliability for what's going on. And I often get asked, how does it work, John? There's a few key elements to it, which again are informed by this whole notion of thinking of the world in terms of cybernetics and homeostasis. First of all, we've got a balance of central and local control. The core of this organization, which has about 80 volunteers, is 3 directors. So we can't even be present at everything, let alone actually manage it. So we've had to build a capability for people locally to deliver what we're doing. So it's a common script, but individual deliveries are very different styles and approaches. Each student works with the parent and learns at their own rate, and that's key as well. We're not imposing a structure in quite that way. And each instructor, very autonomous, working individually with the child and a parent at any given time, is starting by trying to understand where the child is up to, what they're finding challenging, what their needs are for the next stage. So rather than saying it's lesson 3, we're doing this, it's okay, where are you up to? How can I help? Where are the problems, etc. And what we're working with is 3 bodies of knowledge and trying to synthesize learning in 3 dimensions at the same time. We're back to what, how, and why, which is the key part of all this stuff. What do you want me to do? How do you want me to do it? Why do you want me to do it? And if they understand why, interestingly, then the what's and the hows tend to sort themselves out. So we spend an awful lot of time understanding why we want people to behave in particular ways. So each day there are 4, I call them 4 homeostatic learning events. This is sort of a language I'm trialing at the moment, because we don't have lessons, we don't have workshops, we have experiences, or might be a better word than events, where each student is getting a session of practical instruction. They've got somebody sitting in the car with them, working with them. They're doing some driving theory knowledge, typically a theory test rooted in the highway code. They're doing some work on understanding risk and how their behavior manages that risk, and they're underpinning the whole thing by practicing. And of course, the feedback is very evident. If you don't get the clutch down right, that the car doesn't work properly. So there's those 4 learning loops going on for each student, each part of the time. So over the course of a week, each student is getting sort of 20-25 learning events and being engaged in a conversation where they're reflecting for themselves on their learning, with somebody to help them then make sense of it. And their progression through the program is against the demonstrated learning. So they're having to demonstrate what they have acquired by way of knowledge in order to move on to the next more challenging stage. So if they get stuck, and they do, if there are particular problems with things, we're working with them with where they are. The upshot is that on the final day of the course, we're taking young people who 3-4 days ago had never sat behind a steering wheel, and they'll be reversing an SUV with a trailer on the back, and all sorts of interesting things we get them to do, because the intensity of the learning experiences ensures that they've grasped what we wanted. So there's sort of 4 sort of sets of insights from work that I'm currently doing in these, and they all talk to this. They all talk to the inherent cybernetics, the goal-seeking behavior, adaptiveness, about learning, about being reflective, and critically, and this is again an idea that I'm still working on at the moment, what I've called requisite bureaucracy, and that's the recognition that you have to have some rules, because without rules, what you have is anarchy or chaos, or maybe a bit of both. So you have to have sufficient bureaucracy to keep the thing going. But so you have to be controlled, but not stifled. So this balance and argument between stability and dynamism actually is a problem you have to solve in real time. So I called it dynamic stability. It's an allostatic process, and allostatic behavior sort of kind of emerges from the interactions of a dynamical system. So how we use digital capability has to rely on a transition to adaptiveness as the basis of thinking about the organization. So the delusion that most organizations operate under, that there's a stable future if only they could reach it, gets replaced by a recognition that we keep it stable by maintaining its dynamism. It's like riding a bicycle. A bicycle remains happily upright as long as we keep propelling it. Stop propelling it, it will eventually fall over. And these two models at the bottom sort of talk to that sort of space. Which brings us back to the cybernetics of the cybernetics, a recognition of the allostatic nature of a viable organization. And here, and I've used this diagram multiple times before, we all recognize the homeostat sitting at the bottom. It's conventional, tedious stuff. So what's the inputs? What's the process? What are the outputs? How do we understand it? And how do we compare what we got with what we wanted? What's important is when we then think about what is it that this higher order homeostat here is doing, what I call senior management in this particular model, because it's not measuring operational performance. It's measuring the extent to which we have delivered the things that we said we were going to deliver. It's evaluating how well we are managing the problem in terms of the achievement of purpose. So what we're then doing is modifying management in order to improve performance. And so it's a cybernetic process being applied to a cybernetic process. And the challenge to that is, if those of you who are old enough to remember Reggie Perrin, I didn't get where I am today by, and the picking up again the thread that John and I were talking about before this whole session started, is it takes a very self-assured manager, organizational leader to sit in a place where they're happy to allow others to make decisions for them, where they're happy to say, actually, yeah, we did it like that last time and we learned these things, so we're going to do it a different way next time. Partly that's an element of laziness. We've always done it like that, so we'll always do it like that. Partly it's an element of it's risk-free to get it wrong again like we did last time rather than getting it wrong in a different way. But it's also a certain way to stifle the organization, is to keep getting it wrong in the old ways rather than getting it wrong in new ways, and accepting that we will nearly always get it wrong to some degree. There's only a question of the degree of wrongness in our decision making, and being comfortable to, and back to the behavior here, to be able to explain and rationalize our decisions rather than justify our decisions. I did this because in hindsight, maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, but it was what I did, and this was the reasons that I did it. And that exercise of human judgment is something that I think, and maybe it's sort of, I don't know, golden retro glasses or whatever. As a young man joining in banking when I was 18, and then subsequently in a whole variety of organizations, I worked with managers who made judgments and were comfortable to explain and defend those judgments. Today, I find people are much more reliant on a checklist and a paper justification rather than the exercise of professional judgment. And that's an area where I think that the cybernetics can help us to understand and explore that a little more. And this particular model then sort of falls off my website as a way of, I like to think about the way that I work. So I'm sitting in the middle here doing theory and practicing theory, and using my learning to both develop new theory and develop new methods and apply them with the various organizations that I'm playing with. So for us, for the cybernetics of cybernetics, I think, this is kind of where I've been trying to take the Cybernetics Society to some degree over the last couple of years in my incumbency, which I now handed over to Peter Kavlik, was to think about, there's been too much emphasis for me in cybernetics around adherence to a particular structural model, however good, and that's tended to downplay particularly the importance of people and behavior in the way we interpret and use the cybernetics in organizations. So I want to bring that out some more. But that also then talks to the need to engage properly, and we're back to the Sisters of Nazareth here, to actually have the people in the organization engaged with the things that we're doing, to have their ownership, tolerance, commitment to the changes that we're trying to bring about, and that requires a big investment of time and energy to make it work. To think about the governance of organizations in a different way, so that we still need, legally we have to have boards of directors and shareholders and all sorts of other stuff, but actually to think about what are the roles of those people in the organization, what is the contribution we actually want them to make in terms of what does it mean to be a governor, What is it that we actually want directors in organizations to do? It talks very much to the ideas that we must have of autonomy in organizations and going with that distributed power. And I know Angela and I have talked about this previously. Stafford's work is incredibly insightful on the distribution of power in organizations, and his personal belief in that is very evident for me in reading it. But the technocratic interpretation of the VSM, which is adopted by a number of people, and certainly the technocratic interpretation is the right word by those who don't get it. It's a little bit, it's just an alternative hierarchy, kind of missing the point. And I think it was Ashby in the 1950s who demonstrated in his early robotics. I think it was Ashby, might be wrong. The necessity of autonomy in systems by the ability to induce psychosis in a robot by giving it to competing targets, but also by the latency incurred in centralizing control, which means that the robot gets out of control long before you can actually solve the problem. So to address on that, we need to rethink how we exploit the power of technology. I mean, this little typewriter that I have in front of myself is extraordinarily capable. To give you an idea, that when I was talking to people in the railway about their model, they were very, very worried about the volume of work that was required to do in order to process the information. And I pointed out to them that whilst I was happily talking to them on a Zoom call, the machine at the same time was in parallel producing answers which I was using in the conversation that we were having, because the workload on the machine was frankly neither here nor there, regardless of the scale of the problem. That takes us back to the whole need to reconceive the notion of information systems in organization, and particularly the separation of data and information from the platforms on which they sit, and to recognize that the wiring and the machines are a bit like the plumbing and the electrical system. We have to have them, and they're all very cheap. So let's focus on that. But let's think about then what's the information that we really need to run the organization with. And if we start to do that, then I think we can consider and develop the future of cybernetics, as well as, I've written here, building on its past. In some senses, I see some work and I see things which are cleaving to the past rather than building on it, which of course becomes then inherently self-limiting. So that's roughly what I've taken you through. I think most of the headings are about right there. And how am I doing, Angela? I'm probably not far off. 47 minutes, so I'm 2 minutes over my time. I do apologize. At the bottom there's a little advert because we're having a cybernetics conversation in October, in about 3 weeks' time, which is sort of open to people to come along to should they see fit. And that's been me. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all your happy, delightful faces. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for really fascinating presentation and perspectives. I guess that we are all full of questions. So let's start with the questions. Who would like to start? I have several questions, so I can do. I can start with one question when we get more. But the first one is a very generic question, because I think that what is for me more interesting of your presentation is the way that you manage to balance like the traditional view of cybernetics or BSM and more contemporary ways of dealing with process management and information management and all the more technical and traditional things that consultants will do. And I think that there is a lot of clarity in the way that you deal with this challenge, both from the point of view of the methodology you apply, the approach to consulting, and so on. So I was really thinking in the beginning, you were talking about the difference between that you consider that organizational cybernetics help to avoid the divide between soft and hard approaches, aspects of organization. And this was precisely the question that I was asked I was giving a keynote in the Operational Research Society a few weeks ago, and the question they wanted, there was a panel, and that was the question. So I would like to see your question. How do you think that VSM contributes to overcome this divide between hard and soft operational research?
Oh wow, that's a lovely question, and it's a thing that I've fought with since I first read New Directions in Management Science. When was that? 1992, 93. The book was High Vanilla. The book was 1987. Mike Jackson and Paul Keyes. The first time I taught an MBA class, I drew up, and I was talking about systems thinking, and I drew up the system of systems methodologies. And I did it on a grid on a whiteboard. And then the first thing I did, as I started to introduce it to the students, I went around and I removed the grid. Because the system of systems methodologies is essentially a reductionist approach to systems thinking, because it postulates that you can only be this or you can only be that. Whereas the reality is that when you're working with a client and you're working in multiple dimensions, you're working with the hard stuff of numbers and processes and physical bits of kit, but at the same time you're working with human beings, and those human beings have sort of feelings and desires and wants. And the job of the cybernetician sitting in the middle is to surely to be able to synthesize those dimensions into a coherent whole. So we might look at it and describe it from different angles, but we're seeing it in those multiple different ways. And we're seeing it in those multiple different ways at the same time, which is really, really hard, because what you're holding in your head is often two or three slightly different models of the world at the same time. And the conversation that you're having with a client has to reflect those different insights. And if you start to explore the insights, you get away from being trapped in the methodology and start saying, so why are you seeing it the way you're seeing it? How do I help you interpret and unpack what you're seeing? Why do you experience it in the way that you do? And being able to help people have that conversation that unpicks their seeingness from different angles and takes them around and say, well, why don't you stand over here with me and look at it from this angle? And so you are having that conversation. So there's a sort of there's a falseness about it, or a delusion about the divides that we put between things. So the viable system model can only be useful if the people that are affected by it and involved in it, have some sufficient understanding of it, but most important, are critically involved in the decision-making that goes with it. Yes. Otherwise, it is just some smart ass turning up and saying, do it like this. And do it like this doesn't work. You have to be able to take people with you. So it's a synthesis rather than a fragmentation, and the fragmentation frankly gets in the way. But it's really, really hard. You have to have a very enormous big head with lots of stuff inside it to be able to cope with all that, and people struggle.
Yeah. So would you agree with me that this kind of grid and this kind of classification between soft and OR and hard and functionalist had not been particularly useful? And really, when you use the VSM, when you understand properly the VSM, you go all across the grid. It's completely inappropriate to think on the VSM just as a hard approach, or because it has so much of understanding of the human being and cognition and conversations and the power. I mean, if you understand complexity, you need to understand all these soft behavioral aspects as much as hard aspects of process and KPIs and feedback loops and so on. So I mean, in such a way, it's a little bit irrelevant to have.
It's interesting because the only person who really understood the VSM is sadly no longer with us. And I would love to sit with Stafford again today and say, now I've been faffing about with this damn thing for 30 years. Tell me where I'm wrong. And have, I mean, I remember great arguments back in the Athenaeum back in the 90s with him. The first piece of work I exposed to Stafford, and this is sort of useful, was I'd run an MBA class in Singapore. and I wrote it up as part of my doctorate, because I took a single case study and I had 30-something, 40 students in a classroom doing their MBA, and I gave them the short lecture on VSM, and I gave them the case study and said, okay, let's apply these ideas to this case study, and we did it in such a way that said, okay, each group works independently of the others in the sense that you work together to create your solution, but you can share information with other groups and you can ask groups about the information that they've got, and so get into the argument about why they're interpreting it the way they do. It was enormous fun, and they produced basically a series of posters with 6 different interpretations of the case using the VSM as the common convention, and I took that down to Swansea with Robin Asby and whoever else was there at the time, and Stafford spent better part of a day with me sort of arguing about it all. It was enormous fun, but it was all the fact that 36 different people had come up with 6 completely different interpretations of precisely the same script. They were given exactly the same script, and they had 6 very, very different versions of their understanding of what the script meant, but also their understanding of what Stafford meant by the way he wrote about the VSM, and frankly, probably by the way that I taught it. So Ivo's just put in here that the distinction is meaningless. You have to embrace the whole, and the whole nature of the system. Embrace the whole. If you don't embrace the whole, you're just being sort of slightly differently reductionist and probably being a little bit perverse, because you're kidding yourself about the systemic nature of the problem and the systemic nature of the conversation. It's very, very hard. So I'll shut up.
Great, wonderful. Okay, anyone else would like to contribute? Any other questions? Yes, Jonathan.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Angela. John, I'm interested in the extent to which you've come across people during your work who have had no education background in cybernetics, but are kind of intuitively or through their own reflection are actually thinking in very cybernetic ways. Is it something that can naturally arise in your experience, or does someone pretty much have to go through a process of being exposed to the concepts, coached in it before they kind of see the world in those ways?
Well, I once met an accountant at Rolls-Royce. Sorry, Jonathan. I think, I can't remember where he wrote it, but Stafford once wrote, the cybernetics of the situation will assert themselves. So most people who choose to observe an organization will observe something that we would characterize as being cybernetic in the way that the information flows around the thing. They wouldn't necessarily label it in that way any more than people would label something as soft and hard. They don't know it's cybernetics, but you can see the cybernetics operating, and all it needs is one of us to sort of rock up and stand beside their shoulder. Isn't that interesting the way that works? Yeah, I wonder why it does that. And he'd say, well, it's circular causality. Look, when he kicks that end of the bean bag, it gets squashed and it transfers its way through and it pops out the other end. So what's that called? Oh, it's called feedback, and everybody's familiar with the concept of feedback. So I think people are a lot more aware of the cybernetics of the world than we give them credit for, and perhaps part of our job as cyberneticians is to assist them in having a language for describing it with, which rather than, so we don't have to point it out, but we have to give them a label that they can put on it maybe, and have to be able to help sort of, what does that label mean, without getting, I suppose I'm obsessed by the homeostat more than I am by anything else, because once I've got a homeostat, I can pretty much do anything with it, because I can connect it to lots of other homeostats and do interesting stuff. And out of collecting lots of homeostats together will emerge an organization, and it could be a jellyfish with very, very highly distributed, or an octopus, very, very highly distributed control, but still a clear sense of purpose and a clear achievement in life. Whereas if I want to build a nuclear power station, then I have to think about that differently, in the sense that there's a set of constraints that sit outside the organization about public safety and not poisoning people and all sorts of other sort of interesting things, that mean that for the purposefulness of the entity, I have to be able to constrain freedom in a coherent and sensible way, because that's a sort of an environmental dimension, if you like, with a small e rather than a big e. So we have to then be able to say, okay, so there are constraints that operate on this because, and the critical thing is to understand the becauses more than anything else. And again, to engage people in owning the becauses, because then they will behave in the way that they need to, not because we've told them to, but because they can see the rightness of behaving in that way. And we have to be very, I'm going to use the word liberal with a capital L, in the sense that we have to have a mentality and mindset around it that says, I know you're going to fuck up, but that's okay, because you can learn about things and come back and correct it later, as long as, and it's bringing kids up, as long as the kids don't kill themselves or they fall off their bikes a few times, it's fine, because we don't learn to ride a bike, we learn not to fall off. And there's an inherent sort of, what is it I'm learning here? I'm not learning to do something, I'm learning not to fail. That's nice. So we learn not to fall over rather than learning to walk. We learn not to fall off the bike rather than learning to ride the bike. We learn not to drown by swimming. There's all sorts of stuff where what we're actually doing is carving out a space of knots rather than anything else. And that's hugely important. Most of the clients that I work with, certainly at the beginnings of interventions, couldn't give a monkeys about cybernetics or soft systems or indeed anything else. They are interested in, well, where did you get that insight from? And when you start to share where the insights came from, they start to ask questions about the cybernetics. And there's some serious thinking to be done about the extent to which, if I don't make the cybernetics explicit, then to what extent am I trapping you in a sort of slightly differently shaped trap world rather than allowing you to enlighten yourself? And we have to sort of play with that as quite an interesting challenge area on that. So, if you never understand why, you never really get the cybernetics. If you never really get the cybernetics, then I'm doing it to you rather than you doing it to yourself.
Thank you, John and Jonathan. Richard.
Hi, thanks very much, John. The word purpose stuck very clearly for me out of what you've been telling us, which has been fascinating. The thing that I'm interested in is how one deals with a situation where you might have multiple purposes or multiple objectives, some of which may be conflicting with each other, and how you then arrive at if you like, the cybernetic control process, an organization that allows for this balancing of potentially conflicting purposes. I mean, in the world of design, you may have, efficiency versus resilience, but there's probably a lot more in terms of those kind of purpose concepts which have to be balanced out. Now, that would be very interesting to explore. What are your thoughts there?
Gosh, you do like to ask an easy question, don't you? The organizing word in my head is effectiveness. And effectiveness in fulfilling purpose. Much of the rest is actually about constraint rather than about competing purpose. So a social enterprise, in order to be an enterprise, social enterprise, first of all, has to be an enterprise before it can do anything socially valuable. So making a profit is a constraint upon its continued existence. I believe Stafford wrote that in, certainly in Diagnosing, it's probably elsewhere as well. So actually, when we say competing objectives, what do we really mean? Are we talking about things that are constraining? In design, maybe there's a limit to color, there's a limit to scope, there's a limit to materials. So they're not objectives as such, they're constraints on the freedom of the designer. So we'll start to think about things as constraints rather than competing purposes and objectives. And maybe that helps us doesn't change the problem, but it maybe helps us to change our interpretation of the problem. Does that work?
Yeah, I mean, for each one of those constraints, you might think of them as different values. Having ethical, being efficient, all these things are statements of different value components. I think is what I'm thinking of it as.
So, was it Mason and Mitroff? And go back to sort of getting rid of arbitrary distinctions. Mason and Mitroff talked about strategic assumption surfacing and testing, their sort of methodology, which I think sits under wherever it is. It's sort of softish thinking. That's sort of the conversation I might be having with the client might be about. So you'd like X. What's the assumption about the world that you're making that makes that a requirement, makes that a need? So you actually start to explore the assumption rather than the objective, and see whether the assumption holds rather than whether the objective holds. And quite often, out of that rich dialogue, and it is a rich dialogue, emerges a different way of thinking about how you characterize the problem. And then there's the values one is always great. So working with a bunch of nuns as a lapsed Catholic is hilarious, particularly when your sidekick on the particular gig is an Anglican priest. So you can imagine we're sort of sitting here, sort of six very senior, very elderly nuns, one lapsed Catholic and one Anglican priest arguing about the nature of value. I mean, it was kind of enormous fun. But what you have to then be able to do is and this is really heartfelt, is you have to be able to expose in the conversation who you really are. So you stop being a technician or stop being a technical expert, and you start being a human being and exposing your own ideals and values and understanding into that conversation. And that's personally challenging, very exciting at times, and it requires, bizarrely, a lot of humility to be able to do it. But in getting to that very, very personal level of discussion, you start to unwrap what's really going on for people. And in doing that, the compromises, which are almost always necessary in things, start to justify themselves. You start to accept that, the necessary compromises can happen because the good thing that emerges from the compromise is worth it. But and that's so to tell you that I spent 12 years working with the Sisters of Nazareth. I never went home from a meeting or a discussion with them without an enormous smile on my face. They just made me smile the whole time. Even when we violently disagreed on stuff, which we did from time to time. And although it's 6 years since I worked with Sister Mary, who was the Superior General, she and I have a sort of, we have coffee. She's in Melbourne. We have coffee every couple of months, or I have coffee and she has tea, because the friendship that emerges from it is very, very real. So there's a huge part of this whole cybernetics thing, which is about how do you really make it really, really real? Stop it being, it's not a model applied to, it's an engagement and a conversation with human beings that leads us to do things differently as a consequence of the engagement. And that's, that's massive. It doesn't work on an industrial scale. So if you scale up to a Deloitte or a KPMG or whatever, they cannot do what we can do because their institutional system would frankly prevent it. There are too many mouths to feed. John, you've had your hand up a while.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's a question about, it's kind of a two-part question. You mentioned in the railways that you had to use distributed information down to the line level.
Yeah.
And clearly, if you're going to do that, then the people who have that information have to have a degree of decentralized control in order to do something about the information. So the first question is, how did that go? Because you mentioned Wadilt. We've always done it like that. And I imagine saying to the railways, okay, you've got a decentralized control now, guys. It is going to be, it's not going to go down too well straight away. And the second question, which leads on from that, is that if you move from a structure based on authority and obedience to one based on autonomy and cohesion, then that implies a completely different approach to information, because information, rather than flowing from the bottom up to the top so the people at the top can tell what the people at the bottom are doing and reward them or reprimand them, the information becomes essential for the people doing the jobs to do it properly. It's a resource for them to do their work.
Oh gosh, so we're halfway through the railway. So if I tell you that I spent part of my day on Monday negotiating the next stage of the contract, so we're in the course of in the next 6 months, the intention is to build a live version of what's called SARM, the Seasonal Agnostic Railway Model, into a control centre, probably in Swindon, and start to encourage the people there to use the information to manage what they do.
Okay.
So ask me in 6 months, and I'll sort of start to answer it a little bit better. At the moment, we've demonstrated a capability. We've got demonstration versions, prototypes running that demonstrate that the information that's coming out is useful. Whether they can be persuaded to use it or not would be an interesting challenge, because of course, the default is we've always done it like that, and therefore, but they have a process called EWAT, the Extreme Weather Adaptation Teleconference, and I've pointed out to them as an industry that you look on the Royal Academy Engineering X website. There's a study that I've written with Brian Haddock from Network Rail, which critiques EWAT, and EWAT basically says we get a weather forecast. What's the day today? It's Wednesdays. That says on Sunday it's going to be very wet and windy in a particular part of the country, and the wetness and windiness says we're not going to be able to run a normal timetable, and therefore we need to put plans in place that mitigate the risk to the railway, and they do that and update it every day over the next 5 days. So I sat in on a bunch of these EWAT conversations, and you suddenly realise that you've got Sir Topham Hatt, the FAT controller for a particular region of the network, is sat there, and then there are between 90 and 100 other, on a national one, there'll be between 90 and 100 other people on the call, and the call lasts less than an hour. So you've got 100 people who are now guilty of whatever decisions get made in that EWAT, and whatever the consequences of those things are. And yet, with the best will in the world, none of them can contribute for more than about 25 seconds. Because by the time the boss has done an intro and then a closeout, there's not time for anybody to talk. There's no rational reason. So actually pointing out the weakness, the fragility of the decision-making process was kind of not a popular starting point, but you're actually saying that the decision is necessarily incompetent, because you cannot process the information in a way that makes it possible to do anything useful in that time. So what we're hoping to do with SARM is provide an information feed into those conversations that says, here's a predicted impact on the railway over the next 4 or 5 days of what you. So use that information to inform the decisions you're making, particularly about which trains do and don't get run, about feeding that information into an automated timetabling system that kind of says, well, if you took out the 1732 from King's Cross on Sunday afternoon, you wouldn't incur that delay, and therefore the rest of the timetable could run normally. So trying to find a stronger evidence base for some of those key decisions, which doesn't then rely on the poor benighted FAT controller sitting there kind of going, well, the only thing I can do here that's safe is stop the railway, which is commonly what is done at the moment, because there's no other safe decision, because there's no other safe way of making that decision. The data capture, now this is really important. So we're flipping it the other way around. So the data capture at the operational route section says that there are between Paddington and Penzance, there are, let's say, 100 operational route sections, each one a couple of miles long on average. So we're capturing data at that level and feeding it up, rather than capturing it at the centre and pushing it down.
But are you capturing it at that level and using it at that level, or does it all go up before?
A bit of both. So the network control centre at Swindon runs 3 sections of railway: one from London Paddington to Reading, Reading to Swindon, Reading to Bristol, Bristol to Penzance. So you can look at those different segments of the railway, so within the control centre there will be somebody who's responsible for the London to Reading bit.
Okay.
So you can make the decision. So you feed it into a shared system, but then provide it to the local controller for that bit, for him or her to make their relevant decision on their bit of the railway.
Okay, so there is quite a lot of decentralized decision making already then.
Yeah, and in fairness, when Network Rail 5 or 6, 7 years ago regionalised. They distributed a lot of control, particularly over engineering. Now, what's comical is a little bit like devolution to Holyrood and Wales and Cardiff and Northern Ireland, and now the emergence of city mayors. because people don't really grasp the essence of governance, they make a complete hash of the way they distribute power. And of course, you're then into an eternal argument between the people in Westminster and the people in Holyrood are always going to be clashing over where the boundary is. And that's probably a healthy thing.
Yeah.
At a national level, it's possibly less healthy at a railway level when you suddenly find that the Scots have decided to regulate their railway in a completely different way to the English. And yet the railway line goes across the border. And you're suddenly saying there are two different sets of rules that are applying. If you're in Berwick, it's rule one. If you're in wherever it is, I don't know, Edinburgh, it's a completely different rule, but it's the same damn train with the same damn driver on it. So there are some sort of really interesting challenges around how you distribute control, how you maximize autonomy in a thing like a guided railway, where you have to have a common set of rules. Otherwise, it kind of doesn't work as a system. So there's a lot of stuff to be unpacked in there.
Okay, thank you.
Ivo.
Well, Ivo, you have a question. And thank you, John and John. Very, very interesting point and conversation. Thank you. Ivo.
Yeah, thank you, John, for a wonderful presentation. I have a small question. Actually, it's more of a request for clarification. For Sisters of Nazareth, I got organizational transformation part, but what I didn't get was the digital transformation part. That could be probably me, because that was the case I was least interested in. But if you could clarify, that would be great.
So that's absolutely fine. I focused in the talk on the engagement bit, because I thought that was the most important part of the whole thing. And that particular experience, we helped them to create let's call it a resident record system. So some fundamentals. A universal, a single website for the whole organization was kind of a starting point from an information point of view. A shared email system, which they'd never had before. So some basic backbone stuff around having competent networks in houses with wireless, etc., that they hadn't had before. And then implementing a patient management system, or resident management system, which was consistent with regulation in the various different countries, which meant they all end up with slightly different versions. So that dealt with the sort of, if you like, the operational side, and then we overlaid that with a set of and this is really interesting. So we created some global reporting requirements, so that certain things are always reported to the centre in a particular way using a shared system. But equally, because the charity regulation in New Zealand is different to the charity regulation in Australia, and different again in South Africa, they actually had to have localized systems for doing each of those. But what it gave them was the capability to manage at a distance in a way they'd never had before. So again, we've a bit like Fusion 21, capturing data at the point of origin and compiling reports automatically on the back of that, rather than having people sitting in darkened rooms sort of compiling reports later, etc. You can't quite do retail with elderly people in care homes, but you can get sort of kind of close to using the information system to alert, for example, to things like falls or incidents, to what's the word I'm looking for? Medicine failures. So if somebody doesn't get their medication, the system can alert if people's records haven't been kept up to date. The system can alert to that. So you start to use then what's effectively a patient management system. I'll see you soon, Jonathan. To actually inform management about the things that they need to pay their time and attention to. What always intrudes on that in every country is that every country has a system of regulators that sit outside, and they are, if I knew what the word antediluvian meant, they're probably antediluvian. They're sort of prehistoric in the way that they think about and understand regulation, let alone information. And there's a real sort of challenge for any organization with in a regulated environment of managing their regulators as well as their customers, as well as their managers, as well as their, and that's a problem for the railway. it's a problem in banking, it's a problem in care facilities, it's a problem in education, is we have regulators who don't understand regulation. So we have accountability for resources rather than accountability for outcomes, as a particular example. Again, John and I sort of touched on that in the prelims. What we need to get to is a point where, and I work on this hard with clients, let's understand the outcome we're trying to achieve, the purpose to be fulfilled, and then let's design our processes to let us fulfill those purposes, and then let us develop our measuring and management systems to tell us whether or not we're doing it. But we also then at the same time have to be able to spin data out to external bodies who have legal legitimacy in asking questions, even if they're incompetent in doing so sometimes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ivo and John. So, well, it's been a fascinating question. Thank you, John.
Angela, perhaps I have a very small question for John.
Hi, Raoul.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
John, I've been dying to ask you this question. Why did you put the title digital capability?
Where did I put? I can't remember where I put digital capability. Probably like, let me just.
Right. Well, look at it. Why did you use the word digital?
Probably because it was in my head at the time.
Anyway, I'm not going to push you more in that.
No, I think they so again, informed by the sort of the practicalities of working with organizations, is that the data capture, collation, comprehension, reporting is still in most organizations something which is done in the traditional fashion. We write reports, we turn things into PDF documents, we rock up at meetings and people read reports. And actually, the potential for the digital transition is that you can make the machine do most of that. So I was in the control center at Romford 2 weeks ago, and they have this is the rail control center. They have an electrical distribution system that reflects the whole of the Greater Anglia region. So it's enormous. This huge electrical wiring diagram, and there's 3 people sat in front of it staring at screens. And what they're doing is they're watching the network looking for a fault. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, yeah, if you did this properly, the old SCADA system, all you actually need is an orange light that comes on that says, there's a switch failure at location X. The rest of it is completely irrelevant, because what we need is the system to tell us there's a location fault. There's a fault here, and actually get the machine to do the monitoring work for us, and that's the digital transition, rather than doing compiling of reports and things that frankly nobody ever reads, nobody ever uses it. But actually, if we have live information feeds coming from SCADA systems that tell us where it's not meeting our requirements, it's the model of self stuff that's basically saying that we have a process model. And we know it's under control when everything's green. If something turns amber or red, tell us about the amber or red bit, because the rest of it doesn't matter particularly. It's alerting us to an issue. So hence the notion of digital in that sense. That's what I'm getting at, Raoul. That helps.
Well, adding to that, are you seeing the organizations you are dealing with as black boxes with inputs and outputs? Or are you understanding that there is a connection between the operational description of an organization and seeing whether the input-output is complemented by the way in which different interactions are happening within the organization?
Depends. I think the answer is yes and no, because I think it depends on what level. Most of network rail is a complete black box to me. I'm interested in information flows to and from, but if I'm getting into the particular into a detailed operation, then I have to kind of open that black box and find out what's going on inside it. So the system and focus stuff that Staff had talked about, determines whether or not I treat a particular bit at a particular time as a black box or not a black box, because that's necessary to kind of make it work. So you're moving up and down, and if I'm looking at the global problem, then the regional problem is a black box, and I'm interested in inputs and outputs. But if I'm looking at the regional problem, then head office is a black box, and the subsidiary is a black box. But the bit I'm looking at, I might want to open up a little bit more. People are, to a very large extent, inherently black boxes. So because you can't take them apart and find out how they work, can you? It goes down terribly badly with the police. So you have to sort of kind of think about the conversation with an individual is about helping understand them as a black box and how they interpret the world and understand it. And that's the bit in many senses I enjoy the most, if you like.
Well,
Right. Thank you.
thank you, Raul, and thank you, John. So, well, thanks again for a really, really engaging and interesting conversation, John. And I think that we are done for today.
Brilliant. Just remind everybody they can. I'll send you the link to the Cybernetics conversation, but just go to Eventbrite and type in Cybernetics conversation, and you'll find it. And
we will announce it in our webpage so that Metaforum members can join. The next webinar is on November the 8th, not the 1st. We made a mistake the first time. It's November the 8th, and it's Professor Massimo De Angelis, who is going to do a really interesting exploration on using the VSM to think about the commons in a city. So it's a new exploratory field. So you are very welcome. And then the last one in December will be the final one about the cyber scene, another film screening about the cyber scene. So thank you, everyone, and see you next month. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. See you again.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks.